Don't you sometimes wish you'd been around 100 years ago? Life was simpler then. There was a band concert at the gazebo every Saturday night, and if you were lucky, you might get to hear music by Victor Herbert. Let's take a step back in time for a visit with Victor Herbert on A Note to You. I'm Virginia Eskin. These days, musicians wince when I mention the name Victor Herbert. But, it takes skill and craft to write light music. It doesn't just roll off the pen that easily. And it seems that audiences enjoy light music, what we call pops, today more than ever. And when you boil it down, it does have a very peppy, kind of bright and encouraging sound. You wouldn't accuse it of being profound, but that's its great charm. And the other thing, that it's not afraid to be too obvious. We often say heart on sleeve music, but I think there's a place and a time for all of that. And, if you're feeling a little depressed, some pops music is just what the doctor ordered. Our composer, Victor Herbert, took what the Strausses in Vienna had put in motion with their great waltzes. And about the time he was alive, concert band music was really coming into its own. And today we're going to sort of straddle how that intersected, because the Strausses, of course, used a classical orchestra, a small one, to play waltzes. And Victor Herbert didn't use just concert bands, but what he did was sort of amalgamate them. And let's listen to a portion of Victor Herbert's Irish Rhapsody, and that will give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. That was just a portion of Victor Herbert's Irish Rhapsody. You could hear the Irish washerwoman and various other tunes in there. It was played by the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra with Richard Clark conducting. So we're talking about Victor Herbert, and he was born in Dublin. You don't think of him as being Irish, but he was. And the year was 1859. And his childhood was marred by his father dying when he was about 3 years old. And his mother always held him in a very special place, even though she eventually marries a German man and moves to Germany, which helps Victor in his musical development. But in between, there's a little chapter where he goes down to visit his beloved grandfather, who lives in Sevenoaks, which is a suburb of London. And that has a big impact on young Victor because there are a lot of leading musicians and artists, and his grandfather was a very fine artist. And little Victor loved to watch him painting. And he would have heard music. And so by the time he's 7 and the mother and he have moved to Stuttgart in Germany, he wants to be a cellist because back at his grandfather's lovely home, he'd heard the great Petite play the cello. And both he and his mother were very taken by that. It's a good thing that he had an instrument when he's growing up, because I get the impression that childhood was a little bit of a hardship. Germany may have been good for his musical development, but he missed his grandfather. And he studies the flute and the piano and orchestration. And he eventually writes a very nice cello suite. And he also is much in demand as a cellist. And he tours all over the place: Germany, France, Italy, Switzerland. He gets to meet Strauss because he's a very good waltz cellist. I don't want to give you the impression that he wasn't a serious composer. And I'd like you to hear now a movement of his second cello concerto. And you can hear how majestic and passionate this music is, which is just the way Victor Herbert was himself. That was the first movement of Victor Herbert's Cello Concerto, and it was played by Yo-Yo Ma with the New York Philharmonic. Kurt Masur was conducting. Now, our focus today, Victor Herbert, eventually falls hopelessly and desperately in love with a very fine soprano named Therese Fürster, and he meets her when he's teaching at the Stuttgart Conservatory. And boy, he really falls hard, and he wants to get close to her, and there's a dear little story that's told. He didn't know how to go right up and approach her, so he sent her a note, and he said, I have learned that you might need an accompanist to rehearse your parts, because he was a pretty good rehearsal pianist, and I want to inform you that it would afford me very special pleasure if you would accept my services. Well, the answer comes back, but it's in the negative, but he's not one to be put down. He really likes the cut of her jib, and so he keeps writing her, and eventually they do meet, and she falls for him too. And so they must make a very handsome musical young couple, and she's got a great voice, because then when Frank Damrosch in 1886 is going and recruiting musicians to come and live in New York, he's told to listen to Therese, and then she's offered a job to come to the Met, but she says, well, I have my husband, and he's a very good cellist, so Damrosch is not too interested, but he listens to him and he says, all right. And sure enough, Victor gets hired to be the first cellist of the Met Opera Orchestra. So off they go, and they come to New York, and he takes up conducting, and he forms a light music orchestra in New York, and they're playing, sort of like Strauss waltzes, and he's beginning to write what's going to become the operetta-type music. And there's an incredible story of him conducting with a soloist, the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto. And apparently the concerto is going along, and he was quite breathless, and the pianist is having trouble keeping up, and he screams out, your tempo, your dynamics, I can't cope with them. And Herbert wipes the sweat off his face. He says, is that all? Off we go, boys. And the poor soloist is left in the dust all over again. So his Irish humor sometimes gets the better of him. Let's listen to another piece that comes sort of from this period in Victor Herbert's life, and it was written for the Pan American Exposition, which was held in Buffalo in the year 1902, and it's called Americana, Morceau, characteristique. It's a character piece. That was Victor Herbert's cute little Americana, Morceau, characteristique, which just means characteristic piece, played by the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra with Richard Clark conducting. And you could hear what I was referring to a little bit ago, the bright sort of peppy quality. And what Herbert's doing is marrying sort of a ragtime ensemble with some syncopation, and then there's a little bit of a concert band quality. And he doesn't do any one thing too long. There's sort of overtones of classical music woven into a very up-tempo sort of general feeling. And people love that. And he soon realized that musical theater was really an evolving industry in 1900, and he started writing operettas. And he was going to write 30 operettas before he's through. And operettas were just very popularized versions of an opera, shorter and with more melodrama contained in them. But they were very popular because, of course, people could buy the music and people had pianos at home, and they would go home after listening to a operetta and they'd sing the tunes, and everybody had a good time. Now, our next selection is from his Babes in Toyland operetta, which was one of his big all-time bestsellers. It's called The March of the Toys. Everybody has heard that, I think. It's very cute. It's played at the Boston Pops to this day. And Victor Herbert was beginning to make some real money, and his wife is singing at the Met. Everything's going along very nicely. And apparently, he's also trying to become a serious conductor at the same time. And he always hobnobs, I guess maybe being an Irishman, he likes to have a drink, and he goes to pubs with musicians. And being a cellist himself, he has no problem relating, and he doesn't sort of throw his weight around the way some conductors don't like to hobnob with musicians. Not Victor. He's one of the guys, and there was apparently a concert, a benefit, and something went wrong with the valves controlling the water supply for the concert hall, and all the water poured all over the stage. And what's interesting is that he was not undone by this real disaster. And then he jumped in and gave more concerts to raise money because of all the damage that had been done. So I get the impression early on that he's a very friendly and helpful musician. He's not at all a prima donna. Let's listen to Rosa Ponselle singing in a very charming way. It's called Kiss Me Again, and it's from Mlle. Modiste.
In country clothes, as to and from her work she goes, I'd sing the merry lilting strain, and gaily dance to this refrain.
It's so dear. That was Rosa Poncel singing Kiss Me Again from Mlle. Modiste, which was one of Victor Herbert's big successes. It had 202 performances in New York, which was kind of an all-time high, and it eventually has a revival. And he's able to crank out an operetta because the next one that comes along, The Red Mill, was also successful. I love the way she says, safe in your arms, far from alarm. And he would have loved that kind of singing, and there was great charm to it, and people who went to hear it were really turned on by the sentiment and also by the way he turns the phrase, because it's very nicely arched. I'm Virginia Eskin, and today on A Note to You, we've been exploring the world of the great Irish-American composer, Victor Herbert. If you have reactions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. The address is A Note to You, care of WGBH Radio, 125 Western Avenue, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. The email address is anotetoyou@wgbh.org. A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University. Now, the next thing we're going to hear is Victor Herbert playing himself. And that recording that you just heard of Rosa Poncel was actually recorded back in 1920. And this recording was recorded back in 1912. So be prepared for a little scratchy sound. But it's just fascinating that we have the great man playing himself. And he's playing his own piece. It's called Petite Valse. That was Victor Herbert himself playing his own piece, Petite Valse, accompanied by Rosario Bourdon. And in about 1898, Victor Herbert is hired to become the conductor of the Pittsburgh Symphony. And on the face of it, he stayed there 7 years, and it was a good thing. He took the orchestra to a much higher level than they'd been when he was appointed. And his mother gets to come over, her one and only trip from Germany, and sits in the audience and enjoys seeing her son conduct a big orchestra, because that would be a quantum leap from his little light orchestras. But he stumbles on a terrible enemy, and that's a critic named Blumenberg, who's the editor of the Musical Courier in Pittsburgh. And he really has it in for Victor Herbert. There's a quote here, one of his terrible sort of invective reviews. He says, "Herbert is anything but a good conductor. He's not even a successful band conductor. And he has had no experience with symphony orchestra conducting, indeed any orchestra." So, and he goes on and on. He says his beat is wild and amateurish, his musical conception is commonplace, and, this is the kicker, he has no personal magnetism. Well, that was Blumenberg's opinion, and I think Victor Herbert was very magnetic. All the descriptions paint just the opposite. And Blumenberg can't ever sort of let it go. And then he has another enemy, a man named Wilson, who's the manager of the Pittsburgh Symphony. He's also not on Victor Herbert's side. So for 7 years, he kind of battles those two men, and they make his life a hell. And eventually, he tenders his resignation. And the orchestra men write him a very strong letter begging him not to leave. But by then, he's made his decision. He's going to go back to New York and write more operettas and be successful. He doesn't have to put up with that business. So let's listen to another sort of light composition. It's called Canzonetta, canzone, which means song, so it's a little song. And this is the violin version. He wrote two. There's one for orchestra, but I like you to hear this little violin one. That was Little Canzonetta, a piece by Victor Herbert, played by Andres Cardenas with Luz Manriquez accompanying. And of course, music like that is long on charm. You can't just play it without getting involved. It's heart-on-sleeve music, and it has its place. And Victor Herbert was not one to take criticism lying down. He eventually gets involved in a long, painful libel suit against that critic that I was telling you about. He's a strong personality, and the picture that emerges is of this charming Irish, American, do-gooding, very popular, busy comic opera king composer. That would be sort of the picture that if you met him and you were in one of his orchestras, and he extended enormous courtesies, and he, as I said before, he liked to invite you to his home, and he seems to have known how to have a good time. And this next piece would reflect that. And that critic back in Pittsburgh loved to put him down and said that the Champagne Galop was just a work that had no high tone and whose educational value was nil. But listen to it. It's sort of like Lawrence Welk music. It's very cute. Doesn't take a genius to figure that's a piece about champagne. And it's called the Royal Sec Champagne Galop, written by Victor Herbert, played by the Eastman Dryden Orchestra. Donald Huntsberger was conducting. And it sort of occurred to me, I wonder if he ever met Gilbert and Sullivan, because there's a wonderful movie that's playing currently about those two men, and some of his scores remind me of Sullivan's music. Victor Herbert was very successful at this time in his life, and he cranks out all these operettas, as I said before. And the next one we're going to hear from is called Sweethearts, which had over 136 performances. And in different cities, there'd be versions of whatever was current, and with local orchestras playing it. And he wanted to try to stop unauthorized performances of his music. And two lower courts did not support that. And so he appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, which shows again that sort of tenacity that Victor Herbert could have in a crunch. And none other than the great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes decided in his favor. And he eventually is going to get involved with protecting musicians and the formation of the American Society of Composers and Publishers, which became ASCAP. So I'm so impressed with the way he took on large issues, and that's unusual for conductors. They are head in the clouds types, usually. There's a man who's alive today, Gunther Schuller, who's been a little bit like Victor Herbert in that he's championed popular music, jazz, and been a very serious composer and conductor as well. And Victor Herbert was trying to be all things to all people, and I think he really achieved a great deal. Listen to this little selection from his operetta called Sweethearts. That was just a little portion from Sweethearts by Victor Herbert, played by the Eastman Dryden Orchestra with Donald Huntsberger conducting. You could hear some very strong melodies, and it's interesting that Victor Herbert often gives the melody to the trumpet, and that would make the melody more strong than giving it to the violin. It would also make it sound more popular, and Americans would be able to identify with it. It wouldn't sound European, and he's instrumental in getting this kind of American sound underway. And then, of course, silent movies are making their way onto the stages, and those big organs are also being created. And it's a very busy time in American cultural life. Victor Herbert dies in New York City in 1924, and that was the year of the historic concert that Paul Whiteman put together, and he called it an experiment in music. And it had light music like Says Comfrey, novelties, it had Gershwin, it even would have had William Grant Still, and Victor Herbert would have been considered kind of the classical component on this program. Let's listen to the Suite of Serenades, which pays homage to Spanish, Chinese, Cuban, and Oriental motifs. The Suite of Serenades by Victor Herbert, played by Maurice Perez, conducting an orchestra that had been put together to resemble the famous historic Aeolian Hall concert of Paul Whiteman's band from 1924. And it had some very ethnic flavors, the Spanish, Chinese, Cuban, and Oriental movements, and very curious programming, because the first half was quite light, and then there was a piece by Ferdi Grofé, who eventually makes the great orchestration of Rhapsody in Blue, the one that's played to this day. And on that historic program, there was a medley by Irving Berlin, and then the Herbert medley we just heard, and then McDowell, and eventually they get around to the premiere of Rhapsody in Blue. So what a night that must have been. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the program. The music is, as we said before, long on charm. It really speaks from another time. Our engineer today has been Ray Fallon. Our producer is Alan McClellan, and I'm Virginia Eskin. A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University, and it's produced by Northeastern University in cooperation with WGBH Radio, Boston.